a iniciar, gracias Flor, vamos a iniciar viviendo la tercera sesión de su journey de Liderando el Cambio. Recordemos que en la primera sesión revisamos algunos casos, estuvimos teniendo como invitados algunos directores, vimos algunos videos de ellos en donde nos contaban sobre nuevos modelos de negocio, el caso Fénix, Post Go Live, me olvidó, gestión de negocios en un momento complejo, sociopolítico, económico complejo, como en el caso de Bolivia y Argentina. Luego revisamos el Change Toolkit, estuvimos en la segunda sesión con Darío y estuvimos revisando la teoría del cambio a través de un simulador. Y hoy estamos aquí para continuar ese journey, así que no voy a decir más, les dejo con Denis, a quien ya ustedes conocen, para que puedan continuar estas sesiones. Denis, they're all yours. Thank you so much for being here with us, always.
I think time has slowed down this last year and a half, because it feels like I haven't seen everybody for a long time. I was tracking, but the translation button should be available if people want to listen along in Spanish. And I am doing the same in getting the English translation for questions. So please do answer, ask, and have our discussions wherever you're comfortable. So as Miri said, we are halfway through. We're now getting into the second half of our change topics. And today we're going to talk about how do we lead the most difficult change, the really hard change. And a lot of this work is based on two guys from Harvard, Linsky and Heifetz. And Ron Heifetz is still teaching and still working on this topic, still writing on this topic. And their definition, which I think is fabulous, their definition of change is the ability to disappoint someone at a rate that they can absorb. And so when they talk about change, the really hard change, they mean, what is our ability to disappoint people at a rate that they can absorb? And so it could be a little depressing the way it's described. So what they mean is there are people who would step in front of a bus for you, who would take a bullet for you, and they have to get to someplace new, and they're not going to like it. And so how do we bring them along, even if they're disappointed, even if they are struggling, but how do we bring them along with empathy? And that's kind of the leading frame for the session that we're going to go through. I'm going to go through some of these principles of leading difficult change, like I'm going to hit one or two, and then we're going to get into a breakout, and you're going to talk about your own, the difficult change you're facing, and I'm going to ask you to make some distinctions about it. We're going to come back and debrief it. I'm going to talk about a couple more principles. We'll take a breakout. And then at the very end of our session today, we're going to leave some time for you in your working groups to start thinking about your playbook. We mentioned it in the early session, but we're going to take some time for you and your groups to think about how will I lead change differently going forward? And then later at the end of the week, when we are in the last VCE, you'll have a little more time to work on your playbook, but then you'll do a little presentation about what were some of the big lessons learned, what are some of the big ideas I'll take forward when I'm leading change differently. So that's kind of the flow for the session. It'll be a couple of robust breakouts, a little bit of content that I will talk you through. But first, think back to school. When you think of Darwin, when we think of Charles Darwin, who can tell me what's the quote that Darwin is most famous for? Who can tell me?
Survival of the fittest.
Very good. Thanks, Moritz. So that's what everybody thinks. That's what almost everybody thinks is his the thing that he was most famous for in his groundbreaking book. And so people often think survival of the fittest, but that's not what he said, which is, I think, is very cool. So he pioneered the field of evolutionary biology. Linsky and Heifetz's work based on difficult change in organizations is founded in evolutionary biology. And while most of us think Darwin said survival of the fittest, what he actually said is that it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent. It's the one that is the most adaptive to change. And so I think we often make that shorthand that says the fittest or the most adaptive. But the fact is, a little distinction I want to make is Darwin was pretty clear. It is those that are most adaptable that survive. It isn't smart, it isn't strong, right? It isn't technical knowledge, it isn't being an expert in your field. It's the adaptive capacity that we have as leaders. So when I am talking with you about adaptive leadership, this idea of really difficult change, I want to start for some first principles. And the first idea is, even when things are hard, when we think that we're going through extraordinary change, and we are, it's rare that an organization ever changes more than 30%, even in the most dramatic change. Even if you think about Nike, who's moved from retail and said there will be no more retail, no more stores. We're going to focus on direct to consumer. Everything that they believe, everything in their thinking has to change. The fact is, it's still, pardon me, it's still less than 30% of the organization that will actually change. And so the first idea of adaptive leadership is, let's identify what is precious versus expendable. And it is rare in big change that that expendable component is going to be more than 20 or 30%, even at its biggest. It'll feel like more, but it isn't more. And then second is, how will we, through experimentation, and take some risks and find those next practices? Because often it isn't a plug and play. It isn't just that, okay, now we need to be more digital. There's some more digital out there. We buy it and plug it in. No, it requires us to do experimentation and smart risks. One of the things I want to think that we learned in the backstory of Phoenix is exactly that, right? It's many small experiments and a lot of planning and thinking. So we take those experimentations and we take some minor risks to try some new things, and then we integrate those next practices. It's very straightforward, right? It's a very simple way to think about this. But the point that I wanted to start with is, big change that feels big often isn't quite as big once we get a little distance from it and we can examine it. And so one of the first principles I'm going to talk to you about in adaptive change is, we all need to be able to get on the balcony. How do you get enough distance to be able to see the patterns in the difficult change we face, rather than have them be right in your face and on fire? That distance, our ability to get on the balcony and see the patterns rather than be on the dance floor, is one of the key success factors in us leading very effective change, one of the very first ones. So here's the story of the change arc that we're going to talk through today. Part one is get on the balcony and identify the adaptive challenge we face. I'm going to get us into that definition. And so each of you, as part of your pre-work, have a big change that you're either in the middle of or that you're getting ready to get into. And so I'd like you to have that ready so that you take a few notes when we talk about what elements of my challenge are adaptive. I'm going to talk about that. Then number two is, how do you navigate the corporate immune system? Because what happens is, when you try to implement change, the immune system comes out and tries to kill them off, tries to kill that change off. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what are the features of an immune system in the organization. It's not bad. It's not that the organization doesn't like or has a judgment. It's just that systems are built to maintain equilibrium. They do not like this equilibrium. So the immune system comes out and tries to keep equilibrium, doesn't like the change, even though we know it must change. And then part two also says, name the conflict and regulate the distress. And I'll talk a bit more about that. And then at the end, we're going to talk about our job as leaders is to give the work back. Don't do the work for the people who are responsible for the work. And how do we identify work avoidance? That is, when people keep defaulting to the work they know, and they don't step into the hard new work that they must do, what do we do? How do we see it coming? We'll talk more about that. All right. So part one, as I said, job one on leading very difficult change is get on the balcony and name the adaptive challenge. And so on the dance floor is where all the action occurs. It's where most of us grew up in our careers. It was doing stuff on the floor. But if you are part of the dance, if you only can see what's right around you, you actually cannot get to the core source of what the challenges are and the change you face. So how do I get on the balcony? When I think about my change, how do I get a holistic perspective? How do I think about it in terms of a system so I can see the patterns and the people? And that way I can start generating some ideas about what's technical challenge, that is challenges that can be resolved through expertise, and what's adaptive work. That means it's going to require us to learn and do some things and try some things. Finally, the idea of getting on the balcony is, how will I ever know what's not being said? And you'll hear me say this in our second chapter as well. In my experience, people don't resist change, people resist loss. And if we can't name the felt sense of loss, the perceived loss that people believe this change will cost them, then we don't understand it deeply enough. So we do not understand the true meanings and feelings if we can't describe the felt sense of loss that people believe that they face. Okay, so those are some of the big ideas. And so when you go into your breakout, I'm going to be asking you about how will you make time to get on the balcony, to understand the patterns. But then the second, and at least as important, is the change that I'm trying to solve technical or adaptive? If it's technical, the problem definition is clear. The solution is generally known and prescriptive. That means there's probably policy around it. There are probably project plans, a technical challenge that's been solved somewhere in the past. And a technical challenge will be solved through authority. That is, a senior leader can sponsor it and it can get done. Or through expertise. We just need to bring the right expertise to bear. Very different from that, some elements of your personal challenge or your change challenge are going to be adaptive. Adaptive challenges require learning. It's not going to be easy to solve because we have to learn some things first. That learning is going to require experiments. The solution will be arrived at through experimentation and taking some small, smart risks. We're going to try some things, and then we're going to see what happens, and then we're going to try some more things. And then finally, an adaptive challenge is going to be solved through leadership. It is somebody is going to say, this is important for us to do, or through stakeholders, because adaptive challenges almost always span different elements, different businesses, different functions, but they always span and bridge across. They're never singular. You can often find a technical challenge that can be singularly solved within a function, within a business, right, within a particular area of expertise. But adaptive challenges almost always have a bridging function. They run across and they require many stakeholders to work on it to make it work. So I'm taking some time to talk through these two types so that you can be thinking about what parts of my challenge are technical and what parts are more adaptive. So on a technical challenge, it's work that we can do and we can primarily solve using expertise in the house. People we have in the organization in Alicorp today can help solve the problem. Success is often quantified very clearly. We know what it looks like when we win. And it might be complex and it might be hard work, but it isn't disorienting work. It's actually things we know. People may not be central to the solution. Technology could be central to the solution. Sharp, good thinking around this, data may be central to the solution, but people may or may not be required to solve the technical elements of your challenge. And ownership is clear. Somebody owns it. You can point to a senior leader or a function that owns a technical problem. In contrast, the harder adaptive problems, the ones that are the more difficult ones, it's work that we really don't know how to do. It's something new to us in the organization, and so it requires us to think different. It's often not linear. And so therefore, it's hard to quantify success. We might know what the first next steps are. We might know what the first elements of success look like, but the end game isn't quite so clear. Oftentimes, people have to give things up, and whenever the outcome is not clear, things can get emotional. So things have personal ownership. It's not clear on what the benefits are for them, and so emotions rise. And almost always, the people with the problem are part of the problem. And so usually the people who have the problem are part of the problem, right? They like the old ways of working, they're struggling to find the new ways, but they're also reluctant to let go of the old ways and try the new ways. And ownership, as I said before, is across lines of authority. So it requires more stakeholder leadership. It requires you to have a stakeholder map to check in with others who may not be in the direct line of path in what is a classic project management, right? That I need stakeholders to understand what we're doing so that their sponsorship and their support helps me. So I'm just taking a few minutes here for us to talk about this difference between what is technical and what is adaptive, because almost every hard change we face, the most difficult changes, have elements of both. So that was my rapid setup. And so here's what I'd like you, well, let me just pause there. Are there any questions? I've covered a few things very quickly. Are there any questions so far or comments? How will you get on the balcony? Thanks, Shizu. How will I get on the balcony? What elements of my challenge are technical versus adaptive? And we're going to talk about some of the more advanced concepts in a moment, but let's get into your breakouts. And I'd like you to take, Flora, let's do 35 minutes.
Okay.
So get on the balcony and what's adaptive. And one of the interesting questions you'll see here in the first bullet is, do you know what's being said and not said? So when you think about my change is difficult, one of the interesting questions around really difficult change is what is not being said, right? There are things that people want to hold on to. There are reasons that things create friction and they're hard, but what is not being said about the challenge I'm trying to, and where will I look to find it? And then what elements of your challenge are adaptive? Some of it will be technical, but what is it that's going to be adaptive? So let's start with that. Let's get into your breakouts, share your quick change challenge around the table, and then let's talk about these two kind of more substantive questions. What is not being said in my challenge, and what is it that's more adaptive than technical?
And then Daniel posed a question in the chat asking if resolution in the technical space is achieved by technical authority or authority in general.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Danielle. It could be either, right? It could be the boss said do it and we just do it, or it could be I have the authority of technical expertise. It's a supply chain issue. We have a supply chain expert, and this is the best way. So authority goes both ways. Could be technical or could be hierarchical. But it's the adaptive stuff that is interesting, right? That is, your boss says do it, but it's not so easy to do it, or if something keeps getting in our way, then there's something adaptive in that. But thanks for the question.
Okay,
all right, thanks, Flora. Let's do it.
Y un recordatorio, cuando entren al cuarto que les voy a asignar ahora, si abren el botón de chat en la parte posterior de su pantalla, van a ver las preguntas que deben discutir en su grupo. Y yo los traigo para atrás al final de los 35 minutos. Gracias.
I don't see any tears, so the conversations, must have gone okay. I'd like a couple of I want to get you into a break here in a few minutes, but I just want to do a quick debrief. We don't need to hear from every team, but I'm wondering if in some of the teams, what did you think was interesting about the conversation? We framed this up as, can we get on the balcony? understand the patterns and see from a little distance? Can we think about what's adaptive versus technical? And can we think about what's not being said? What is it that people are experiencing but they won't say? And how would we know? But I'm wondering where was the energy in your breakouts? What did you talk about? Who'd like to jump in?
Hi, Dennis. Let me do this in Spanish, please.
Please.
Bueno, en nuestro caso hemos discutido bastante porque somos de distintas áreas, ¿ya? Acá quiero compartir, digamos, mi punto de vista de lo que yo he visto. Y es que nosotros estamos pues en la vorágine del día a día. Para que tengas una idea, yo trabajo por el área de materias primas, entonces tengo mucha relación con distintas áreas, doy servicios a distintos negocios y trabajo con mucha coordinación con el back office, con el middle office, con taxes, con planeamiento, etc. Y lo que hemos estado haciendo para tratar de ver cuál es la situación de nuestro día a día es tener algunas reuniones que nos permitan ver qué cosa no está del todo bien. Y lo que salió a la luz es pues la vorágine de reuniones que tenemos. Y a diferencia de un escenario pre-COVID, donde antes ni siquiera en el directorio entraban 25 personas, ahora vemos que en una reunión online hay a veces 30 personas, y a veces cuando tú ves a la persona, haces alguna pregunta, la clásica respuesta es, perdón, estaba hablando en mute, o se me entrecorta el internet, cuando en realidad lo que es medio obvio es que no ha estado prestando atención ahí, ¿no? Entonces, creo que esa parte es algo que ya no estando en el día a día, sino tratando de alejarnos un poco, es un problema que tenemos, probablemente no solamente en mi área, sino también a nivel compañía. Y me parece que hay una parte muy importante que es adaptativa, ¿no? Hay un tema de cambiar mindset, de cambiar la forma en cómo priorizamos las reuniones, cómo delegamos, cómo damos más empowerment a los equipos, cómo priorizamos. Entonces, eso como parte de lo que yo pude compartir dentro de la reunión que, digamos, del grupito que hemos tenido, ¿no? No hemos detallado en cómo solucionarlo, creo que eso va a ser parte de las otras etapas, pero creo que en mi caso es algo que hoy por hoy llama la atención y creo que el contexto lo amerita, ¿no? Cómo mejoramos esa situación que tenemos hoy.
Shizu, is it the distance, or is it lack of clarity in the meetings? Because those are some pretty big meetings.
Sí, mira, no tiene que ver necesariamente con la claridad, sino con la cantidad de gente que a veces hay en una llamada, y finalmente todos empezamos diciendo, estamos abordados con muchas llamadas y no tengo tiempo, pero nos damos cuenta que no todos son necesarios en la llamada. Y que al final, mal que bien, estás haciendo mucho multitasking y estás escuchando con media oreja mientras haces otra cosa con la otra oreja y no prestas atención a ninguna de las dos cosas. Y eso te termina disminuyendo la productividad y a la vez sí, haciéndote sentir muy sobrecargado. Cuando en realidad si priorizaras una de las dos cosas y delegas lo que no vas a hacer, creo que nos iría mejor a todos, ¿no? Ahora, eso, Denis, tiene que venir de un cambio, creo yo, adaptativo, que va de punta a punta, desde los directores, por no decir solamente el CEO, sino desde el board, hasta los analistas y practicantes que a veces demandan muchas reuniones para cosas que creo que debemos empezar a tolerar ciertos mínimos errores, pero por el riesgo de toma de decisiones que ellos puedan tener, ¿no? Creo que debemos ser capaces de aceptar que no todas las decisiones van a ser 100% como nos gusta, pero lo perfecto es enemigo de lo bueno, en este caso.
Yes, and you get a high bias to action culture, lots of meetings, and you know, this is going to sound very rudimentary, very basic. Is I spend a lot of time with teams, with senior teams, and I come back to two big things. One is productive norms. Have we spent a minute and talked about how we are going to operate when we're together? Like that distraction thing is a big waste of time, you know, and so why are people there? Too much time on the calendar, I get it. But one thing is productive norms, and the other thing is disciplined processes in the meeting. And so we all know, so I spent time with teams where we simply on the agenda say, this item's for communication, this item's for input. We want your input, and this item's for a decision. But sometimes we're not always so clear for what's your role, what is our role in the call, if it's just for information sharing or if it's for to provide input or decision. It sounds a little silly, but sometimes we forget. And then the other one is sometimes we don't structure them well. So if the meeting is about clarity and accuracy and getting specific, then you adhere to a rigorous process during the meeting. If the meeting is about creativity or new thinking, then you get very clear about the outcome and you release the process. You get super clear about what we want to get out of it, and then you don't worry so much about the process. You let the team, but sometimes we don't go into the meeting with those disciplined processes in mind. And then you get 40 people and it can be a circus. So I'm not saying that's the answer, but some of those little things help. But 30, 40 people in a meeting, I just don't know. That sounds like one of my nightmares, you know, if that's your day all day long as you go through. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Shisu. And when you get to adaptive issues, that makes it twice as bad because people get disoriented, and the larger the group, the less likely it is we have a common understanding. Is there another group or another team, or even if you were in the same group, but what else was interesting in your conversation?
Sí, Brian, si me permites.
Dale,
Adelante.
dale, Daniel, dale.
Ya, gracias. En mi grupo, bueno, la energía estuvo muy buena. Somos de áreas distintas también y hemos estado conversando sobre diversos ejemplos y qué cosa tendría de adaptativo cada reto. Hemos visto varios, uno relacionado con el pricing en el negocio de nutrición animal en VitaPro, y también un ejemplo que yo creo que sería pues por excelencia un reto adaptativo, el ejemplo que estaba relacionado con precisamente cambiar las formas en que, es decir, cambiar los procedimientos que hemos venido desarrollando en general en Alicor, esa forma conocida de obtener resultados, ya como segundo ejemplo. Y el mío, que quizás lo veo como más simple, pero que se trata de, en una situación compleja de ajuste de gasto en la que estamos, lograr que la planta, esta planta que está aquí, esté más ordenada, más, digamos, limpia, pero con menos recursos. Es decir, que se trabaje mucho en el orden, en prevenir el ensuciamiento, digamos, de la planta, generar suciedad. Y eso es algo que está en todos los niveles, enraizado como siempre limpiar y no necesariamente evitar ensuciar. Entonces, tengo al equipo de mis reportes como responsables de un equipo operativo, de coordinadores y operativo, que va a tener que adaptarse a esta realidad urgente de encontrar soluciones, de mantener las plantas ordenadas, limpias, y digamos, y que siempre funcione así. Esto aparentemente es un asunto técnico, yo aplico las 5 S, etcétera, pero no necesariamente es sostenible si no lo vemos como un cambio que la gente tiene que asumir. Digamos, las personas, si tienen ese modus operandi por muchos años, es difícil que se mueva de un momento a otro. Eso era.
Yeah. Daniel, I love that because on the surface, it sounds like a technical challenge, right? And so, but underneath, it is more adaptive. And I'm going to do a little bit of a commercial, but in our next VCE at the end of the week, you have the Trouble at Tesai case study. We're going to do that case study. And this was about the people that clean the Japanese bullet trains, right? And they get more cars, different cars, less time, and less people. And so this is your problem, right? this is exactly the challenge. So I think that'll be pretty interesting later in the week. But I think, as you say, below the technical challenge sits something like ownership, personal ownership, self-directed work, close to the face of the work. But there are some shifts in the way people think that are required that isn't a policy, right? Or it isn't a practice, but it's some thinking that people have to do. I think that's going to be a great example. And let's talk more about that later in the week. We're going to fix that for you, no problem. Yes, Jessica, how did your team go?
Sí, Denis, de hecho, sumando lo que pone Daniel y también Chisu, yo creo que nosotros, mi equipo tenía una energía, hemos hablado creo que de todo un poco, pero nos enfocamos mucho en el tema de Fénix, ¿sí? Y el punto que tú comentabas de la disciplina, yo creo que es un punto importante, porque vamos a poner, Fénix llevaba no solamente un cambio tecnológico, sino también de adaptación, porque estábamos cambiando procesos. Y eso toca varias fibras dentro de la organización. Entonces, al hacer estas mesas, primero era trabajo colaborativo, involucrábamos a varios actores. Segundo era la co-creación, liderazgo, y cuando hablo de liderazgo es la jerarquía. No había jerarquías, ¿sí? Podíamos estar analista, jefe, gerente, director en una misma mesa, construyendo un proceso que era transversal. Pero para llegar a eso, ¿no? Habían estos manuales, esta disciplina, estas reglas que poníamos sobre la mesa. Todos los que están acá tienen y opinan lo mismo, apertura completa. No hay roles de liderazgo, ¿ok? Las tareas son asignadas y son entregadas en un tiempo muy breve, ¿no? Que llamábamos a la agilidad. Y lo otro eran las retroalimentaciones. Eran tantas mesas en tan poco tiempo que teníamos que mejorarnos y nuestro proceso tenía que ser continuo. Entonces parábamos y así 5 minutos al finalizar la jornada y decíamos qué debimos cambiar, qué no funcionó, ¿no? Para la siguiente sesión, de 20 sesiones al día siguiente, de 20 mesas de trabajo. Entonces, yo creo que esa apertura a la comunicación, ¿no? A la escucha, suma mucho en un proceso de cambio o un proceso en el cual hay la parte técnica y la parte adaptativa. Lo otro es que lo técnico, en nuestro caso, teníamos a los expertos, es correcto, pero nosotros, el negocio, fue el que llevó el proceso de cambio, ¿no? De Fénix. No era el equipo de TI. TI estaba apalancado, es correcto, pero el negocio éramos nosotros los que conocíamos el proceso. Entonces, yo creo que eso es un tema que pusimos sobre la mesa. Y lo otro es las personas que colocamos en las mesas, ¿no? A los que eran estas 350 personas de Fénix que finalmente fueron asignadas. A mí me preguntaron, y y se lo comenté al equipo, a mí me preguntaron si yo quería dejar mi rol de 3 años y llevar un proyecto en el que no sabía nada, absolutamente nada. O sea, era de cero. ¿Estaba dispuesta o no? Esa fue mi pregunta. ¿Estaba en mí aceptarlo o decir que no? Y eso creo que es válido y eso es importante. Cuando te invitan y no hay una imposición a que tienes que ir, entonces tu energía creo que te la bloquean. En mi caso, la invitación sumó. Me sumó a asumir algo nuevo y lanzarme a la piscina y comenzar a nadar en ese mundo que nadie conocía. Yo y las 350 personas que estuvimos asignadas al proyecto. Eso para comentar, Denis.
Like it. Yeah, I like it, Jessica. And I love that there are so many features of that. One is you remove the hierarchy, which increased ownership. And then I think the periodic check-ins, sometimes communication is about listening and reflecting the feedback, and then people feel heard. sometimes the communication is just connection. That is, people want to pause and connect and just check, and we all together. So probably it got you both alignment and information, and got you into a cadence and a rhythm to get the work done, and take out the hierarchy, and then boom, the ownership level rises for people that, I mean, people at Alicorp are driven and they want to succeed. And so when you unleash some of that, then that's fantastic. So thank you for sharing that story. I'd love to hear some more, but I'm also watching my time. So Cristel, let's please go ahead, and then I'm going to get you to a break. Crystal, please.
Hola, Denis, ¿cómo estás? Hola, Denis, hola a todos, ¿cómo están? Bueno, yo quería, en nuestra mesa también hablamos bastante de nuestra experiencia Fénix. VitaPro está en medio de un blackout en este momento. Estamos próximos a salir en vivo con nuestro nuevo sistema. Y concordamos pues que, complementando lo que decía Jessica, ha habido una metodología y una infraestructura y toda una maquinaria para asegurar pues que este proyecto sea un éxito. Claramente esto representa para nosotros un cambio tanto técnico como adaptativo, porque tenemos mucha claridad del proyecto, es un cambio de plataforma, cambio de tecnología, tenemos deadlines claros, tenemos mesas de trabajo bien definidas, etcétera. Pero también hay una parte importante que nos centramos en discutir bastante en nuestro grupo, y es la parte adaptativa. ¿Qué implicaba esto? Y obviamente implicaba pues dejar de pensar como silos. Entonces había un cambio de mindset, deja de pensar como silos, empieza a pensar como macroproceso de generar valor. Al menos nosotros en VitaPro tuvimos bastante el chip de adoptar, y ahí hubo bastante resistencia, porque cuando te dicen adopta, o sea, creo que ahí mucho del speech se enfocaba en qué estoy perdiendo al adoptar y no tanto en qué estoy ganando, porque era bastante claro el mensaje, yo creo, de decir, estamos adoptando prácticas mundiales, estamos adoptando las mejores prácticas en procesos, pero una de las preguntas que teníamos guías era, ¿en qué momento hablábamos de lo que no se ve? Porque creo que estábamos muy enfocados, hemos estado muy enfocados sí, a toda esta infraestructura técnica, a esta metodología ágil, que en verdad ha sido un éxito. Pero si tuviéramos que, desde nuestro grupo, pensar en aprendizajes, al menos yo creo que faltó un poco el pensar o entender lo que no se ve, lo que no se decía en esos weeklies, el estrés que estaba sintiendo el equipo, porque para que este cambio sea un éxito, la parte adaptativa y el cambio de mindset no podía estar en qué estoy perdiendo, tiene que estar en qué estoy ganando. Y hasta hace pocos, escasos 4 semanas, les comentaba al equipo que yo todavía sentía, yo estoy en el BAU, pero sentía que el equipo Fénix venía mucha con mentalidad de esto lo hemos perdido, en vez de un lenguaje de esto hemos ganado, ¿ok? Entonces ha sido un reto, un poco el bajar el proyecto a BAU y cambiar ese mindset. Entonces ahí para mí hay una oportunidad de aprendizaje, porque no solamente tenemos este proyecto, o sea, estamos pasando por otros grandes proyectos, tanto en Alicorp como en VitaPro, que si vemos hacia atrás, todo lo que hemos hecho bien es un montón, pero también tenemos una oportunidad para seguir fortaleciéndonos como equipo, porque lo que sí es cierto es que hoy en día, en la coyuntura que estamos, lo único seguro es el cambio. Vamos a seguir cambiando cosas, vamos a seguir transformándonos, y estos son grandes hitos que nos dan gasolina para seguir en esta dinámica, pero yo creo que discutíamos bastante escuchar a los equipos cómo se están sintiendo, porque son cambios sin precedentes y no todos respondemos de la misma manera. Entonces me acordaba mucho de la sesión anterior, donde hablábamos de la curva del cambio. ¿Cómo identificamos en qué parte de la curva están los equipos desde espacios más cualitativos para ayudarlos a avanzar también en la parte emocional y mental? Porque el cambio que estamos pasando, como te decía, lo habíamos identificado más como mixto. O sea, necesitamos que esté no solo la cabeza puesta sobre la mesa, sino también el corazón y nuestra predisposición, ¿no? Entonces ahí ese era un poco lo que estuvimos también conversando sobre experiencias de cómo identificar en qué parte de la curva está tu equipo, qué haces para poderlos mover de espacios, ¿no? Porque creo que por ahí se enfocó un poco nuestra conversación. Y en verdad hablamos de otros proyectos de transformación que habían pasado, por ejemplo, Chile, y se hablaba un poco de lo mismo, ¿no? Los miedos de la gente, los miedos y los temores de pérdida de la gente y cómo movilizarlos.
Wow, in 30 minutes you did that. That's pretty amazing. That was you covered a lot of ground. So, Christelle, a couple things on best practices, I think. One is, what we don't want to do is drive what the felt loss is underground. We don't want to minimize it and say it's not true, because people do feel like there's some loss, but we also can't live there. And so I think the interesting thing is, for really hard changes, can I articulate the loss that people will feel? Can I say it so that they tell me that's right, so they know I understand it? And can I do that with empathy? That is, I understand it's difficult and we still have to move. And then can we get to balance? So if that is the felt sense of loss, then what is it we are winning? So I think in there, you get the winning through acknowledging the loss and moving through it. And then people can move through it actually more quickly.
Totalmente.
And yeah, yeah. So I think that my youngest daughter, I promise we're going to go to a break. One of my younger daughters had listened to me years ago when I was teaching change management, and then she said at the end of it, I was saying, so what did you think? And she said, so you can visit Pity City, but you can't live there. And I said, yeah. That's exactly right. You can feel sorry for yourself for a little while, but then you got to move along as we come out of those change curve. As we come out of that change curve, we're going to come back to this and talk about this in a little more detail. Flora, let's do 10 minutes. Everybody stand up, get some air, walk around, stretch out. But let's take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back and get into the next chapter. Thank you all for the excellent thought and conversation. Okay, and Danny, can you hear me?
I can, but I think a minute ago you froze up, and I think your audio might have gotten cut. Can you hear me, Dennis?
Yes,
Hello?
can hear both of you.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Well, I was saying to somebody, my headset apparently thinks it's a new day every day, so it can't decide if it's going to hook up to my laptop or my phone. So sorry about that. I could see you talking, and well, welcome back. Hopefully you had a quick break, and we've talked a bit about one of the hard things to do is to get on the balcony. And then another difficult thing is to really think about what elements of the change I need to lead are adaptive. They require some learning because most of us, we love technical challenges. We like to fix things with process, project plans, because we want them to be orderly and we want them to be efficient. And adaptive changes tend not to be efficient. They tend to be a little messy and they require us to try some things. And so when we go to chapter 2, I want to talk about these things. And I mentioned this in my in my preface and my early comments. How do we navigate the corporate immune system? How do we name that conflict, which we've already talked a bit about? And then how do we regulate the distress that people feel? Because to get to someplace new and difficult change, there is going to be some level of distress. We can't remove that. We can't take it on for people. They do have to work through some difficulty themselves. And so this is a great quote I love about the corporate immune system. It says, never underestimate the desire of human nature to maintain the status quo, right? This is one of the paradoxes of change. Everybody wants things to get better. Nobody wants to change. But the fact is, we do have to keep evolving. We do have to keep moving forward. So every organism has an immune system, including corporations and organizations. It's not evil. It's not malicious. It's just trying to preserve the status quo. Most systems strive for equilibrium. And so our job is actually to disrupt the system, move things forward, do some things differently. Now, usually the immune system is apparent, or you can see it through precedent. This is how we've always done it. We've been successful so far, so we shouldn't change. People, well, Alfredo wouldn't like that, or so you name the authority figure, but sometimes it is the founder, it's combining the history we've had, plus the kind of company we are, its culture, or its process. Look, this is the way we spent a lot of time doing this, and this is the way we should do it. And people don't like to come off of processes that were hard to get in place. And so the immune system shows up in precedent, people, or process. And let me see. Here is my favorite equation for difficult change. Let's see if this shows up. Okay, so on the bottom right, you'll see this. P squared plus P squared does not equal F squared. And that stands for preserving the past plus perfecting the present does not equal finding the future. And I'll say it one more time. Preserving the past plus protecting the present does not equal finding the future. We often forget that. We often think about continuous improvement as a way to get us to the future. We often think about our long history of success as helping us find the future, but those two things don't help us find the future. But we do have to try new things. We have to try different things to move ourselves into the future. So the main way that we navigate the immune system is through experimentation. Does anybody want to guess? You can do it on the chat or you can do it out loud. Does anybody want to guess how many experiments Google does in a year on average? How many experiments does Google do? What do you think? There's no penalty if you get it wrong. 500, it's a good start.
1,000.
How many?
1,000.
5,000. 1,000. Yeah. 2,000. 1,000. I love you guys, but you are way off. So Google does about 20,000 experiments a year. Oh, I think I sent that to Flora instead of everybody, but 20,000, right, is what they do. Now, Google can cheat a little bit, right? Because they're a software company, they can segment off a segment of customers and clients, and they can try some new things with them in these sandboxes. But the point is that their culture is one of constant experimentation and change. What is working? What is working? Is this working better? Is this working better? And move. So the beauty of experimentation is that everybody can be open to trying it, right? If you say, let's just try it, let's try one and see, let's see what happens. Everybody can be open to an experiment. And second is, whenever you see good experimentation, you can run 2 or 3 experiments at the same time. Well, let's try one in this direction and let's try one in this direction. Let's see which one's best. So those parallel experiments allow us to quickly generate enough information to make a higher quality decision. Or if they aren't going to work, we quickly find out they aren't going to work. And finally, us calling something an experiment, us framing something as something we're trying rather than a full commit, also lets us be more open to contrary data. Let's imagine we don't find what we were expecting in our experiment. It's a little easier to take on board contrary data when we haven't made that as a full commitment in direction, the function, the business in one place. So experimentation is one of the most effective ways that we have to navigate the immune system that comes out and tries to slow down or kill off your change. So what are the few things we can try? So when you hear me at Korn Ferry, when you hear me advocating something new, what you'll hear me say are things like, what's the first next step? What's that? What would be our hypothesis here? What could we try and see? Just to get people moving in that direction, and then everything's easier after that. So here's where we are in the adaptive leadership storyline. We have some data. We have some problem identification. And in that, when we first start, we need to get on the balcony and we need to start thinking about, what is it that's not being said? Do I see enough of the landscape and patterns? I love one of the earlier comments was, are we seeing, what are we not seeing, right? Or that's another version of what's not being said, is what are we not seeing that could still affect us? And then we move to interpretation. Once we're on the balcony and we can see the landscape, the patterns of our change, then how do we host a variety of interpretations and listen? And again, the Phoenix example was a great one where they did quick listening sessions. And so what Linsky and Heifetz calls, what is the song beneath the waves, right? What is that little tune that we're not quite hearing, so that we can have as accurate a diagnosis as possible? So we listen for what's not being said. And then finally, when we intervene, when we act, we do it through experimentation, right? We're going to take some small risks. It's one of the ways we navigate past the defense systems in the organization and groups who are very invested in a particular way. So these are the experiments. These are the patterns. This is how we go about it. So that's where we are in the story. Now, here is one of the really critical things when we think about adaptive change, and that is, in this second chapter, the idea that you have to name the conflict and regulate the distress. And so we mentioned this just before the break, and that is, can I actually name the conflict, tension, issue and put a name on it so that we can get past it? And in difficult change, what we don't do is you need to think about the adaptive change as a thermostat. And I think Daniel Ratty, that translates to Spanish directly, doesn't it? So we need to think about the adaptive change as a thermostat in your house. What we don't do is just flip it up on high heat and walk away. What we do is we regulate it. And so we turn up the heat on the change that we need, and then we have to watch people's reaction. And if they start getting overwhelmed, if they start disengaging or disconnecting, we have to turn the heat back and give them some technical work to do. Give them work to do that they know before we turn the heat up again. But that's how we regulate the distress of really difficult change. And so part of that regulating the pressure is also the sequence and the pace of the work. And you all know this. In fact, Shizuo, you spoke about this. And that is, sometimes it seems like everything is important. There's so many meetings, there's so many initiatives that we aren't clear with people about what's most important. What are the most important things? And so therefore, when there are too many things and too many calls and too many meetings, we can overwhelm and disorient the people who actually have to take responsibility for the change because they just have so many things going on. That's number two. And then number three is we as leaders, we have to have the emotional capacity to tolerate people's frustration, right? People are going to be, it's going to be hard for them. They are going to feel uncertain. They're not going to be sure. And sometimes that comes out as frustration or anger, or it could be the people who are saying they were on mute in the call. Maybe they aren't listening because they're slightly overwhelmed. Maybe it's just been a little too much, but our job is to hold tight, right? Our job is to have the emotional capacity to tolerate that uncertainty and just hold the line. So we do it with empathy. This is really difficult. I know this sucks right now. This is hard, but we do have to move forward. So we have to have that personal emotional capacity to do that. So that's the idea of name the conflict. So here's what I'd like you to do now. Flor, let's get into our breakouts again and talk about chapter 2. And here is when you think about the change that you're trying to put in place, where is the corporate immune system going to come out and try and slow you down? Where does the corporate immune system come out and try and counteract the changes you're trying to make? Is it a history? Is it certain kinds of people who are vested in the old way? But where does that come out? And then maybe first and third question. And then the third one is, can you predict where the frustration and uncertainty will arise? Where are people going to start to get disoriented and frustrated? Do we know when it's coming? Because if we can see it coming and name it, we can head off a lot of the negative consequences of it when it does come up. So where's the corporate immune system going to come out and work against your changes? And when people do get frustrated or they do get disoriented, where's that going to happen? Let's take a shot at it. Let's get into our breakouts. We'll take 25 minutes and then we'll come back and talk about it a little bit. Welcome back, welcome back. Even a couple of smiles. So this is getting better. It just takes a couple hours. Excellent. So some folks we may not have heard from, but what was interesting or important in the conversation you just had? We talked a little bit about the corporate immune system. What is the kind of tension that's going to rise out of the corporate immune system to slow change down or stop it? And then we talked a little bit about, can we predict the kind of frustration or difficulty that people are going to experience? Because if we can see it coming, right, we have a good chance of doing something about it. Who'd like to start? By now you all know me, but you know I'll call on people. I'm just saying, I'm warning you.
Alex is raising his hand. Alex is raising.
Alex.
Yes.
Sí. No, les cuento un poco que veníamos conversando. La verdad es que no pudimos abordar todas las preguntas, pero nada, hablábamos mucho de las diferentes coyunturas, ¿no? Y cada país y cada negocio tiene una coyuntura muy particular. Hablábamos un poco de la coyuntura que vivíamos en Perú, en diferentes negocios, y hablábamos del tema de la comunicación, ¿no? Del esfuerzo, del gran esfuerzo de estar todos conectados con una misma idea, ¿no? Sea que haya mucha o haya poca comunicación, sea que los temas estén o no estén resueltos, pero que lo que se tenga lo manejemos todos, ¿no? Porque hay que dar claridad a los equipos, hay que dar claridad a los clientes, ¿no? A los socios, en fin, a todos los interlocutores, ¿no? Y creo que en Perú estamos, creo, en un momento pues, complicado y algo que nos lleva a la reflexión de eso y el esfuerzo de todos, desde el colaborador hasta el gerente general, ¿no? En tener una comunicación muy fluida para que todos estemos en la misma línea, ¿no? Viviendo lo mismo y con las mismas respuestas, ¿no? Ahora, hay mucha incertidumbre en general, hay cosas que no estarán cubiertas, pero dentro de lo que se tenga, ¿no? Estar todos muy conectados, ¿no? Entonces, como que le dedicamos mucho tiempo a esa parte de la conversación y bueno, y no, tampoco respondimos más preguntas, ¿no? Pero quería compartir con ustedes eso.
Thanks, Alex. I think it's a fascinating time in many regards. That is the future of leadership. The future that as we look forward is going to be, how do we prepare people for the unknown? How do we prepare people for emergent issues and more unknown? Because we talk about clarity, but we can't always bring clarity, right? We can bring clarity for a short period of time, and then something big happens and changes. And so, but clear communications is a little different. If we can have aligned and clear communications, and we can talk about what we can talk about, and we can stay aligned around that, that actually creates a sense of comfort for people and a sense of connection for people. So I think it's we tell people as much as we can, but sometimes the connection is more important because the future is a bit uncertain. So there's, I think, a couple of interesting ideas. What else? Who else? Something else that you thought was interesting in your conversations? Please go ahead, Ronaldo. Yeah.
¿Qué tal? Buenos días. Sí, alineado un poco a lo que comenta Alex, también estuvimos conversando con el equipo sobre la importancia de la comunicación y tocábamos el tema de la pandemia y ahora digamos, de la situación política y económica que vive el país, ¿no? Y empezando cómo la pandemia, o sea, a nivel de las plantas, cómo esto ha sido todo un reto, primero el año pasado cuando teníamos muy poca gente para producir, y para empezar lo más preocupante es mucha gente contagiada y en hospitales, ¿no? Y todo lo que se construyó para darle soporte y darle acompañamiento a todas estas personas que estuvieron mal, ¿no? Y que la compañía hizo un esfuerzo tremendo a nivel económico incluso, ¿no? Para cuidar a su gente, ¿no? Nos tocó, como en todos sitios, comunicar decesos, comunicar fallecimientos, y tratamos de hacerlo lo más claro posible, lo más transparente, porque, o sea, teníamos que seguir produciendo, porque producimos alimentos y son muchos de primera necesidad, ¿no? Entonces, había que comunicar el mensaje de una forma adecuada para darle tranquilidad al equipo, para que siga comprometido con nosotros y siga cuidándose también, y que nosotros estábamos apoyándolos en eso, ¿no? Y este año la figura, digamos, ha cambiado porque ya es un año, digamos, un poco más controlado a nivel de pandemia, ¿no? Pero que a nivel nos está golpeando a nivel político y económico, obviamente, y tan es así que en la planta en la que yo estoy, en esta época, digamos, estamos haciendo el 80% de lo que realmente haríamos, ¿no? Y eso incluye, obviamente, un cambio dentro de la estructura operativa en la planta, y la gente, si tú llegas con el mensaje adecuado y apalancado del compromiso que ellos mismos han visto el año pasado como compañía cuidando a su gente, ellos también ponen el hombro, ¿no? También ponen el hombro. Ahora estamos en planes de vacaciones muy riguroso porque, o sea, lo ameritan los volúmenes, ¿no? Y la comunicación nuevamente es fundamental para darle transparencia, para darle tranquilidad a la gente, ¿no? Para que entienda que esto es coyuntural, pero que estamos tomando acciones, ¿no? Y te da soporte en ese sentido, ¿no? Y por ahí va mi comentario también, soportando un poco el tema de comunicación. ¿No?
Well, thank you for that. I think on one hand, people will step up when they have work with purpose, if they feel it's important and meaningful work, and if you are feeding people. But I think your first point, I think, is super interesting for all of us, and that is, as a leader, our own emotional self-regulation, our ability to bring calm and help steer people, it has a huge impact, right? I think when we respond dramatically, or if we don't have that emotional self-regulation, we can make the problem twice as bad. But I think you said maybe tranquility, but I think the idea that we bring some calmness and then some predictiveness to this, then makes people want to rally around and put their shoulder into it. I think that's huge. That's really huge. Thank you for that. I know we could do this for another hour, but I usually run the clock out. So I just want to get to a couple of other ideas. This is that last chapter. I'm just going to frame a couple of ideas for us. And here, this is the hard work of leadership in change. This is the hard work. And that is, can we give the work back? And how do we battle work avoidance? Because as leaders, oftentimes, we don't want people to struggle. We want to help them as much as we can. We want to give them guidance or enough structure so that they can get things done quickly. But often, people look up the chain of command and they expect their leaders to meet the challenges that they actually are responsible for. And so we can get into a bad cycle of doing our team's work, right? We know the work, we have a good view of what should happen. And so sometimes under difficult change, people look up for guidance when what we don't want them to do is wait. We actually want them to keep moving and trying. And so getting people to assume the responsibility is not easy, because in times of difficulty, many people are comfortable with more directive management styles. And so here is, how do we let our people take the initiative? How do we support them in problem solving? And support, and I mean support, not control. So sometimes it's easy for us to say, let me structure this, let me break this into these boxes. If you just do this, then you do this. But that's actually their work. If we don't delegate a little bit of ambiguity, then they'll never learn. They'll never learn to adapt and handle some of these adaptive changes on their own. And so our job is to give the work back and let people struggle a little bit so that they learn some of those adaptive skills and keep moving rather than waiting for you or me to tell them. So that the idea of giving the work back. Here's the second big idea in chapter 3, and that is work avoidance. Now, some people like this term, some people don't. But when I say work avoidance, I mean the resistance that emerges to protect the status quo. So whenever we are trying to progress a difficult change, we're trying to move forward on some adaptive challenges, the resistance that emerges that protects the system, that's work avoidance. That is people who are trying to keep doing things the same old way and not the new way. These are the big five. Work avoidance can come up and look like denial, and that is, this really isn't a problem. We really don't need to change. Work avoidance can also look like escapism. Well, if there is a problem, it's not my problem. It's over in supply chain, or it's over in materials, or it's over in, you pick, right? It's in finance. If they would just approve the, but so escapism is another demonstration of work avoidance. Scapegoating is the third. Sometimes you'll hear work avoidance come up like, well, if Alfredo would just tell us what to do, if the government would just calm down, if the auditors, if you're in a heavily regulated industry, if the auditors would just leave us alone for a little bit, that's scapegoating. That is pushing the responsibility to somebody outside of what we have control over. Number 4 is cynicism. Says, well, there's nothing you can do. Well, we have this kind of a government in Peru. There's nothing you can do. We have to wait them out. Well, that's not really true. There are things we can do. And then the last one, number 5 here, is the hardest to see and one that we can all fall into, and that is fake remedies. And that is when we see a very difficult problem, we try to define the solution of that problem within the skills that we have today. Oh yeah, this looks a bit like an X, so we'll just use our X skills so that we can solve this problem. And if it's really, truly an adaptive issue, there's going to be new skills we need. There'll be new skills we have to learn. And none of us like to seem unskilled. None of us like to waste time in experimentation that might not work. But truly adaptive problems, adaptive change requires it. And so us not falling into any of these, being able to identify these work avoidance techniques or these work avoidance kind of symptoms is step one so that we can address them. And we can come back to what's our work, what's your work, and what are the expectations about how we move forward. So that's work avoidance. It's a complicated drawing, but I wanted to put it all together here at the end of this teach piece. And so here, if you see the gray line on the left, that is a technical challenge. And so on the left, you'll see disequilibrium. That is this change disorienting to me? Is it a bit disorienting? So technical challenges start off very disorienting. Like when Phoenix first started, how will we ever get this done? It's massive, it's huge, it touches everything. And then very quickly, we start to get a grip on the change. We start getting it in a more predictable place. And then there might be one bump. You might see one place where, oh, we didn't expect that. But then we continue over time, which is the bottom axis. We continue over time to start sorting it out. The disorientation and disequilibrium drops, and we make progress. This is why adaptive challenges and adaptive changes are so hard, because they start out not so disorienting. They don't seem very difficult or very disorienting until we learn more. And then we realize how complex they are. How will we keep the plants cleaner when we have fewer people and less time? And at the beginning, it sounds like a problem we can solve with expertise and technical, but it will not be. It'll end up being something we have to solve with culture and mindset, the way people think about things. And so what happens is we start learning more about the problem, and then it seems really disorienting, and then we make a breakthrough and we start to figure it out. Then we realize we still didn't understand it, and we get another bump, and oh, wow, that's even harder than I thought. And then we'll start to figure that out, and then we'll learn something new, and we get another bump. About the third time you get surprised by something that doesn't go the way you think, that's when you see the green work avoidance starts to pop out. We start seeing work avoidance. People start saying, oh, it's impossible. Oh, if they would just tell me. Oh, if, you know, then we have to address that work avoidance. And our job is to hold fast, hold steady. And so my point is simply this, that is an adaptive challenge will go through several bumps of uncertainty as we learn and apply and do the experiments. And they take longer than a technical challenge. And it's hard to keep people engaged in the most adaptive challenges, but that's the work, right? That's the work of leadership. And then finally, that little gray bar at the top, which is a fabulous, it's a fabulous term that says the productive zone of equilibrium, or it's actually the productive disequilibrium. And that means we want people to be uncomfortable. So we want them to be a little bit disoriented, but we don't want them to pop out the top their limits of tolerance, because then they check out and disengage. And so there's a band of discomfort, but still engaged. That is the work of leadership. How do we keep people engaged and moving forward with a really hard change? All right. So our job, hold steady. When we do the hard, difficult change, take the heat, patiently let the issues ripen is a nice way to say, don't immediately fix it for them. Have people struggle and try to find solutions. You can step in and fix it, but they should make the effort to fix it as well. Help people stay focused on the few things. And I think often we think we've said it enough, and then usually you have to say it 3 times more. Ask tough questions so that people have to think rather than just take guidance. We ask the questions and then continue to say, well, what's that going to look like? What's the first next step? What kind of an experiment could we try to see? But keep encouraging experimentation, not big things, just how do we keep people moving forward? That is adaptive change. All right. So I am just looking at my clock. It's just coming up on the half hour. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to be available to answer questions for anybody. But for the moment, I want to get you into your small teams to talk about your personal playbook. Again, we mentioned it in the first session. Now is about 20 minutes for you to take some time. Let me just see. Floor, let's give them 25 minutes for you to take some time in your small groups. So you've learned how to think about difficult change today. We've talked about, you've been able to work on some systems change in the simulation. We've talked about some amazingly good examples of AliCorp so far. And so knowing what you know at this moment, how will you plan to lead change in this uncertain future we face? And how will I contribute as a leader at AliCorp? We want you to start the conversation today. We'll have some more time in VCE number 4, but we want you to start the conversation so that each of us is taking some notes about our personal playbook so that we can present back in the next session. What are some of the big ideas that I can take forward as a leader that I can pay more attention to help facilitate this difficult change that we're facing? 25 minutes to start getting your big ideas around for the playbook. We'll see you back here in a few. Some of you even look happy, which I love to see. So we were able to talk through 3 chapters of this adaptive change, this difficult change. Hopefully along the way, you've picked up 2 or 3 things where we said, you know, I knew that, and now I can put a name to it and have some strategies, or hadn't thought about it, the ideas of work avoidance or why some change is much more difficult than others. We'll do a little reflection session at the beginning of VCE 4 and just see what kind of things came to mind for you. But Miri, do you want to bring us to a close at the end of our time together here?
Of course. Thank you, Dennis. I will switch to Spanish now. Bueno, equipo, muchas gracias por su participación activa durante toda esta sesión. Hemos terminado la tercera sesión de Liderando el Cambio y para la cuarta sesión, importante que podamos traer nuestras notas referente al playbook que han venido ustedes trabajando en grupo, porque vamos a continuar con ello en la cuarta sesión y van a presentarlo hacia la última hora. Habrá un jurado invitado también para que nos pueda dar sus perspectivas en base a lo que ustedes han presentado. Y también importante que puedan leer antes de la sesión 4 el caso sobre problemas en TESAI. Hemos enviado un correo con esta información hace unos días. De todas maneras, les dejo por el chat el link donde pueden encontrar el documento. Si lo necesitan en inglés, me pueden enviar un mensajito y yo se los paso también en inglés, no hay ningún problema. Así es, Travel at TESAI en la versión en inglés. Y bueno,
mira, una consulta, muy claro la parte del caso. Lo que no tengo tan claro, tenemos un equipo, tengo claridad sobre los casos, digamos. De hecho, pensaba en el caso que me interesaría, pero ¿es un trabajo individual o hay un grupo asignado? Eso no tengo tan claro.
En el equipo que han sido asignados hace unos minutos. Con los
pero estábamos, en el último, porque estuvimos
en el último. Sí,
okay,
en el último.
Listo. Okay.
Sí, con ellos van a seguir trabajando en la cuarta sesión.
Perfecto.
Perfecto. Cualquier duda o consulta adicional, estamos atentos.
Y veo que Jessica tiene la mano levantada.
Sí, Miriam, un favor, ¿me puedes pasar el link del playbook? Porque eso creo que lo vimos en la primera sesión.
No, el playbook es un producto, es el entregable que ustedes van a presentar en la cuarta sesión, que es básicamente las preguntas que ustedes han venido conversando hace unos minutos, en estos últimos minutos con su grupo. Le llamamos playbook a este.
¿Pero hay algún formato? No hay ningún formato.
Es a tu discreción.
No, formato, es lo que ustedes, como ustedes decidan presentarlo. Puede ser un slide, 2 slides, como ustedes decidan presentarlo.
Una consulta,
Miriam, es solamente... Perdón, Alex, dale, perdón.
Sí. No, yo queremos apuntar lo mismo. Voy a preguntar, Miriam, si de cara a la última sesión va a haber tiempo, porque nosotros hemos conversado y no hemos apuntado nada. Entonces, ¿tenemos que hacerlo previamente a la última sesión o va a haber tiempo última sesión?
Van a tener tiempo otra vez en el VC 4. Les vamos a dar tiempo en sus breakouts, ya para que lo puedan finalizar. Inmediatamente saliendo de su breakout, ya lo van a presentar ahí con el panel ejecutivo.
Exacto.
Una consulta, Daniel, pero entiendo que no es un caso específico, ¿no? Esto es algo como un playbook en general, ¿no? Para
Es general, es con todo lo que han aprendido, ya con mañana van a cerrar el círculo de todo el contenido que van a recibir. Entonces, ¿cómo es que ustedes van a liderar en Alicorp, ¿no? De cara a este futuro incierto, y cuál va a ser la contribución desde tu rol? Esas son las dos preguntas, esencialmente, y esa es la discreción de ustedes, cómo es que lo quieren armar. Algunos ponen un slide o dos slides, algunos solo hablan, como ustedes quieran. Abierto.
De acuerdo, gracias.
De acuerdo, gracias.
Listo, muchas gracias a todos. Que tengan un
Gracias a
buen
todos.
día.
Gracias a todos. Chao, chao.
Lindo verlo.